Three kids turn up to a football match. One is tall. He's 50 feet tall. Right, okay, fine, he's not that tall. One is average height, and their friend is very short. A low wall separates the stands from the field, and they're in the front row. The stadium's packed. It's standing room only. The tall one can see over the wall easily. His friend can just about get her nose over, but their small companion hasn't got a chance. All of them are equal. They're all standing on the ground. They all paid the same amount for the tickets. But is it fair? A steward offers our little friend a stool to stand on and a box for his mate. Now they're all the same height. It's not equal, each is standing at a different height, but it is fair. Everyone can see the game. Life is full of inequalities. Some of them are unplanned, like the height of that wall. Some have been built intentionally, like racism. When inequality exists but isn't put right, it's called discrimination. We discriminate all the time, and that's a good thing. After all, why would you choose ugly clothes, a tasteless meal, or a boring movie? Calling someone discriminating is a compliment. It means they have good taste. The problem comes when we discriminate between people for reasons that are based on fear or prejudice. It's fine to choose not to spend time with someone if they're hurtful to you. The problems start when you begin to treat people differently based on their race, gender, or beliefs. People who are discriminated against feel vulnerable, depressed, lonely, and fearful. Imagine how bad it feels if government, business, or society as a whole discriminates against you. How would you feel if people were against you everywhere you went?
Social class in America can be hard to talk about, and not just because you may find it awkward to discuss who's poor and who's rich, or who has more power and who has less. As sociologists, the difficulty for us is in pinning down exactly what we mean by social class. There isn't just one definition of it, and the definition you use will depend on what society you're interested in. If we go by Marx's definition, we have two classes: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who do the labor. But this might be too simplistic for our world. A social class can be defined as a group that's fairly similar in terms of income, education, power, and prestige in society. And we can use this definition to better understand the social classes that make up society in the United States. Broadly speaking, American society can be split into 5 social classes: upper class, upper middle class, average middle class, working class, and lower class. The upper class consists essentially of the capitalists in Marx's system. This is the top of the income and wealth distribution, those who earn at least $250,000 a year and control much of the country's wealth groups. Upper middle class families typically have incomes between $115,000 and $250,000 per year and make up about 15% of income earners. About 2/3 of the adults here have college degrees, and many have postgraduate degrees. It's almost a given that their kids will attend college when they grow up. Now, families in the so-called average middle class make between $50,000 and $115,000 and make up about 35% of income earners. Most blue-collar workers, or those whose work is primarily based in manual labor, fall in the lower middle class. About 30% of Americans are in this category, with incomes ranging from about $25,000 to $50,000 a year. And just as vulnerable to economic downturns, if not more so, is the lower class. Lower class Americans are blue-collar workers at the bottom of the income distribution. They make less than $25,000 a year and tend to work hourly jobs that are part-time with unpredictable schedules and no benefits, like health insurance or pensions. About 20% of Americans, or the bottom quintile, fall into this group. The majority of these families don't own their own homes and are more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher rates of poverty, lower quality school districts, and higher crime rates. In contrast to an upper middle class family whose children are likely to go to college, only 9% of the children born in the bottom income quartile complete a 4-year college degree. And the lower class also includes many Americans who are living in poverty. The US government sets an income benchmark called the federal poverty level, a threshold that's used in part to determine who's eligible for public assistance programs like food stamps or help with health care. As of 2017, the federal poverty level for a family of 4 is $24,600, and 13.5% of Americans live in households below that. The government arrives at this figure by estimating the minimum annual pre-tax income that's needed to pay food, shelter, transportation, and clothing costs for a given household size. Of course, what's poor in the United States won't be the same as in another country. The US federal poverty line is a measure of relative poverty. based on a standard of living in the US. Relative poverty is used to describe a lack of resources compared to others who have more, but absolute poverty is a lack of resources that threatens your ability to survive. The federal poverty level gives us an indicator for which Americans have the fewest resources and lets us examine trends in groups that are the most economically vulnerable. For example, groups that can't work, like children, the severely disabled, and the frail elderly, are particularly vulnerable to poverty. But many working Americans are vulnerable to poverty too. 12% of working-age adults in poverty work full-time, and another 29% work part-time. These are the working poor. You can see how it's quite possible to work full-time and still live in poverty when you do the math. The federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 per hour. A 40-hour work week for 50 weeks a year would net an income of $14,500, which is well below the poverty line for a family of 4. It's hard enough to pull yourself out of poverty on a low-wage income, which is partly why more than half of families in poverty are headed by single mothers. Higher rates of poverty among women, known as the feminization of poverty, is related to the increasing number of women who are raising children on their own and who work low-wage jobs. But in addition to gender, you can also look at poverty by race. Contrary to popular belief, most poor Americans are not Black. In fact, 2/3 of the poor in the US are white. Black Americans are, however, more likely to be poor than white Americans. 24.1% of Black Americans, who make up about 13% of the total American population, were living in poverty in 2015. Compare that to 11.6% of white Americans, who make up about 77% of the total population. Now, the causes of poverty are many, and it's not easy to understand why some groups are more vulnerable than others. America likes to think of itself as a nation that values self-reliance, where anyone can succeed. And this view is partly why some argue that poverty is the result of an individual's own failings, or of certain cultural attitudes. By contrast, American sociologist William Julius Wilson, who you might remember from episode 7, has provided a counter to this idea. Wilson has documented how Black Americans are much more likely to face institutional barriers to achieving economic success, and are more likely to live in areas where jobs are scarce. He argues that in order to understand poverty, we have to look at wider economic and social structures, as well as the history and culture of racism in the US.
You might have already noticed this, but when people talk about justice, a lot of the time they're really talking about stuff. Like, who has more stuff, whether that's money, food, or access to services like healthcare and sanitation. Who gets to decide who gets what, and on what basis. Finally, there's the very simple-sounding approach advanced by 20th century American political philosopher John Rawls. He argued that justice is fairness. Any inequalities that exist in a social system, Rawls said, should favor the least well-off, because this levels the playing field of society. This is a form of need-based justice that focuses specifically on making sure that everyone is actually in a position to achieve their basic needs. Rawls reasoned that the world is full of natural inequalities. Think of all the things we talked about when we discussed moral luck. A lot of factors that will shape your life are totally out of your control. So Rawls' sense of justice means correcting for those disadvantages that are beyond our control.
I guess activism was like my way to connect back to my identity. My name is Nautica Williams. I'm 17 years old. Right now I'm about to graduate from Oakland High. The start of my life I was in Oakland, and then it got too expensive for my mother, and we moved in with my grandmother in Pacifica. It was hard. I was like one of the poor Black kids living with a bunch of like wealthy white kids in the community. Not a lot of people understood like the struggles that I was going through. So I moved back to Oakland a little after 7th grade. I had a huge culture shock because I went from Pacifica, it was like really affluent, white, not really diverse, and I came to Oakland and I saw all these people of color, people speaking different languages, like different foods, right? And I was completely shocked. And I also started to learn that school is not set up for everyone to succeed. In Pacifica, everyone believed in me. Like everyone knew they were gonna go to college, everyone knew they were gonna graduate. It seems like a given. You didn't really have to think about graduation. And I remember coming to Oakland, a lot of students were like, oh, we're gonna drop out anyways. We're not gonna make it. Or teachers telling me that I'm gonna be the one who graduates. Right, I'm one of the few who's gonna graduate in this class, right? And then just tosses aside the rest of the other kids as I can't help them anymore. And Californians for Justice was handing out popsicles, and I really wanted a popsicle. And so I went, they talked about it, they're like, we do racial and educational justice, we talk about racism and sexism, and I'm like, cool, things that impact me and that I wanna learn about. I started to learn about the school-to-prison pipeline. I learned about colorism. I learned about racism and how it's a system. It was really my start in organizing.
Lo único que nos separa es fronteras, nada más. Mi nombre es Walter Díaz, soy de El Salvador y tengo 19 años. La banda es llamada Latino Machine Band, presentada por Lincoln High School. Yo comencé a ser líder cuando entonces todos los integrantes decidieron de elegirme a mí como líder. Nosotros creamos esto ahora porque por lo que está pasando ahorita en los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Que hay muchas personas que están siendo deportadas, familias siendo separadas. Creamos la banda Es un Club para dar a entender a todas las personas que no saben nada de nuestra cultura, como por ejemplo canciones. Crear una banda es para unir fuerzas entre otras nacionalidades y decir que somos humanos. Salí de El Salvador, tenía 17 años. Como mi hermano fue parte de una pandilla, decidieron a los pandilleros en querer hacer daño y quererme hacer daño a mí y a mi familia. Yo cuando venía en el camino y con mi hermano, la verdad sentía que nos podía pasar algo. Los dos pusimos fuerzas y gracias a Dios y llegamos a la frontera de Estados Unidos con México. Los policías nos agarraron. Como había dicho anteriormente, estuvimos en cortes y ganamos unos papeles. Ya todo mejor. Pero como dije, no me siento aún a gusto por otras personas que no tienen esa oportunidad.
He predicted I'd develop into a 9th grade reporter. He was right. Worked on a now buried graphic as a police reporter, and then on the San Diego Sun as a waterfront reporter. Wrote a few novels, wrote about a dozen yarns for the screen in Hollywood, and now a corporal in the United States Army. ...
At the age of 17, Sam joined the New York Evening Graphic as a crime reporter and political cartoonist. His mother hoped he'd stay in the safety of cartooning, but Sam was drawn to the streets. Perhaps Sam's unique film style finds its origins here, combining the streetwise sensibility of a crime reporter for the Hearst tabloids and the graphic intensity of a political cartoonist. One thing is certain, Sam seemed to absorb a profound sense of value and purpose from the newspapermen around him.
Don't let anyone ever tell you what to print. Don't take advantage of your free press. Use it judiciously for your profession and your country. The press is good or evil, according to the character of those who direct it.
Holy smoke. So, this man, Mr. Arthur Brisbane, was very important in my life in explaining that to get the truth of any story is almost impossible unless you yourself are personally involved. And even then, there are moments, now listen carefully to what he said, even then, when you know who is guilty and not guilty, even then there's a question, because your mind doesn't work the way you want your mind to work. You're not a camera, and a camera can lie, too. It's a question to a goddamn shadow, because in the shadow is the killer, but he's not seen. So you see, the photograph of a killer does not exist. It's black. He says, remember those things when you're on a story, and don't take anybody's word, including your mother's. If she's a nice woman, that boy, why he wouldn't hurt a fly, don't believe her. Don't insult her, but don't believe her. Don't believe yourself. When you talk to relatives and friends of anybody who's involved in a story, don't believe them. Go to their enemies. Don't believe them. What you have to do is weigh.
And that is constant for him. I've said things to him that, well, so-and-so said this to me, and he'll say, well, who the hell is so-and-so? What does that mean to me? I don't give a shit about so-and-so. Did you see it? No, I didn't, but I heard. Oh, you heard. Well, that means nothing to me. You know, he doesn't care about what you heard. He still has that thing about, if I experienced it, then I understand, at least I understand the experience from my point of view.